I was a medically trained speech pathologist helping people to recover from brain injuries. And then in 2019, I had a brain injury. I wasn't able to remember the words that I was going to say, thinking my nervous system was like on fire. They told me that. Well, this is just kind of how life is now, and thought this can't be all there is now.
Welcome to the Mindfulness in Motion podcast, the show that helps you move beyond the checklist of life and into a world of joy and meaning and discovery. I am your host, Corey Micah, and I'm delighted to have our listeners and watchers here with us today, and to have Dr. Sarah Young with us today, who's a neurodivergent clinician and founder of NeuroSynergy Integrative Health. In this practice, it's about how nervous system safety transforms the way you heal and move. I was actually on Dr. Young's podcast not too long ago, depending on when we're airing this one and when that one airs, who knows, maybe they'll both go out at the same time. But I was on Dr. Young's podcast and I was so taken with how the display of what I am going for in this podcast, which is this mindfulness in motion, she displayed this in the way doing the introduction to her podcast, and of this very slow and very intentional way of speaking. And it really spoke to me. It was like, this is mindfulness in motion in the podcast introduction, which is why I wanted to invite her to be on our podcast. So thank you so much for having me on yours and for being willing and saying yes to being on this one. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It was such a blast to have you on Neuroalchemy.
Nice. Yeah, it was really fun for me too. So because I've talked about that piece of the introduction to your podcast and how it's so displayed to me, mindfulness in motion, would you mind sharing with us like how you introduced your podcast, why you introduced it that way, to kind of give us a little bit of the story about you and the work that you do?
Yeah, so the way that I begin each show is just to bring everyone into just the space of realizing that however you're arriving today is okay, and it's important to enter the moment, right? To enter the moment, to breathe into the moment, even if it's just one breath. A lot of times when we are living life in 2026, there's always something that has to be taken care of. There's something on a to-do list. We're running around. We're multitasking. We're doing multiple things at once. And so for my podcast, it's really important to me that when we come into that space that we all kind of sit down together. I almost see it like we all kind of sit in the floor in a circle and we take a breath and we come into that one consciousness space, right? So we're all kind of invited into that space. But when we become aware of that opening and we can just breathe into that space and be present with it, it is very grounding. And it allows us to participate more with whatever's coming.
It's so beautiful. And this is the piece when I'm in the water and I'm teaching people in the water, it really is to help them be in the singular moment that they're in versus the terror of the potential. I mean, how many stories I have of students who are like, what happens if I end up in the middle of the ocean? And I have to okay, well, we can talk about that, but first let's practice being where we are, which is not in the middle of the ocean. And by the way, if you found yourself in the middle of the ocean, you would want that skill to have yourself be fully present and to be able to be in that moment. And because then, I don't know, if you're in the middle of the ocean, what's for dinner next week is not pertinent. You want to just fully be in that practice, in that space. Well, tell us a little bit about, so that's your podcast, and then tell us a little bit about your practice, your other work that has led you to want to have this podcast space that you've created.
So my podcast space started because of the work that I do with NeuroSynergy Integrative Health, and I'm going to back it up a little bit more so I can kind of give you my why. I was a medically trained speech pathologist working in the hospital setting, helping people to recover from brain injuries and strokes, teaching them how to talk again, remember again, swallow again after their bodies and brains sustain neurological injury. And then in 2019, it was raining really hard and I was running late for work, and it was an hour and 30-minute drive to work. It was pouring down rain. I was paying attention, but when I came around this curve, there was a giant tree that had fallen in the middle of the road in a storm. And I was on a mountain road. There was nowhere to go. Like, it was a wall of dirt over here. And it's like you're either going to run into that tree or you're going to quickly turn your wheel. So I did not have a lot of time to think, but I quickly turned my wheel. I hydroplaned into a very hard surface and was unconscious, had a brain injury. And, it probably wouldn't have been as difficult to have had the brain injury if it hadn't been my seventh one. But because I had had many already, it was like a pile-up effect. And the result of that brain injury was that I now wasn't able to remember. I wasn't able to remember the words that I was going to say. I had trouble with problem solving, organizing, thinking. My nervous system was like on fire. Everything was like, talk about fight or flight. It was all the time. It was 100%. The anxiety, the nausea, the headaches, the dizziness, and more, you name it. The physicians that I was working with, it was, the information I was given was like, well, this is just kind of how life is now. And I had two teenage daughters at the time and thought, this can't be all there is now, because when they tell me I'm going to a friend's house, I can't remember that they told me that, right? And I need to be able to do that to be a parent. So I started searching and taking classes in many different things, eventually landed on a PhD program in integrative medicine, in order to kind of, okay, there has to be more to this, right? There has to be more tools that I can have in my toolbox. In my PhD program, I learned about nutrition, biofeedback, neurofeedback, herbs, plants, the gut-brain connection, the heart-gut-brain connection. I learned about a lot of things that I didn't know about before, but those were the things that led me to be able to be in front of you having this conversation with you here today. It's what allowed me. And it wasn't just one of those tools, right? It wasn't like, oh, you took that plant and now you're all better now. For me, that's not the way that the story went. It was like piecing together a puzzle of a multi-dimensional types of pieces. And now realizing, like, I'm not the only one who needs this. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not the only one that can have that other way, that can have this different pathway. So I need to create something in the world so that exists, so that other people that are going through something like this, they can also have that path. And so that, even though that was kind of a long answer to your question, Corey, that is the spirit behind NeuroSynergy. And now it probably makes a lot of sense. Neuroalchemy, you've been on my podcast, and it's all very multidimensional, and it's all about real healing.
One of the big things, well, first, let me say thank you for sharing that story. And I'm grateful for you surviving and finding thriving through those events in your life. One of the things that it perked up in my head is one of the pastors at our church. He was just a part-time pastor, but his full-time job was to work with people who were unhoused. And he would have conversations with us and saying one of the big things that we don't think about within that population is how many traumatic brain injuries they have. And, how judgmental we are of, like, they're not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, but traumatic brain injuries, I mean, it's a reason why we use the word traumatic. They're a really big deal. So for you to have found a pathway working with your brain that we love so much, that takes care of us in so many ways that we don't realize until it's been injured in such an impactful way. So I'm glad that you have found, and I imagine are finding, I imagine you're still working through pathways. So that's one thing that struck me. The other thing that I would like to highlight, and you can say more about this, is you're saying it wasn't a herb. It wasn't a thing. I think this is such an important message for us to know about because we do wish for and hope for singular fixes to things. I was actually just this morning thinking about GLP-1s that are very in the news and real topical right now. And they do make a huge impact for people for changing their blood sugar and for changing their weight, if that, but it doesn't mean that they still don't think about food and exercise and other ways that you care for your body. It is kind of being advertised as this panacea. But it actually, we still have to have multiple ways of caring and loving for our brains and for our bodies. Yeah, so I think that is an important, really important piece there, that it's okay to take lots of different pathways and to discover. How did you go about figuring out what these pathways and trying out the different things to find the ones that were working for you, especially given you were doing it while recovering from a brain injury?
I know, it's very interesting. It's quite the story. I want to just comment a few things based on what you said, just to clarify. So absolutely, brain injury is an invisible injury, right? That's why we call it an invisible injury, because you can look at me right now and all things look great. They look physically formed, right? I don't have another appendage growing out of my face, or it's not cracked down the middle and like you might see in a movie or something like that. You're absolutely right. And that is a very important point. And that's why we have to always be mindful that we don't have any idea what the person next to us is dealing with or what they've gone through or what they're going through. So that's number one. Number two is that you're correct on the second point also. There are things about me that are not all better yet. And probably those things may not ever be. What are those for me? So I'll tell you. One is I won't know if you're telling a joke. So if you're being sarcastic with me, I won't be able to read it, and I'll read it like it's a fact. And then if you tell me you're joking, I still won't find it funny. Not too bad, right? Sometimes I can't recognize faces. So people look very similar. It's called prosopagnosia. It was much more apparent after the accident. It's much better now than it was, but I still struggle with that somewhat. And every once in a while, I'll have more difficulty under the following three circumstances. And these are universal. So if I get under the weather, like I get COVID or I get the flu, if I get really, really stressed out, like I got more on my plate than I should be managing, or the third one, if I've not had good sleep. Under those three conditions, the person that you will meet is very different than the person having a conversation with you right now. Because when one of those are met, when I'm under the weather and my body is fighting infection, I don't really have the cognitive reserves to be able to do all the high functioning things that I can do in my day to day. So it's really important as a brain injury survivor that I make sure that I take care of my immune system and that I make sure that my health stays really well. And you can, eat really healthy food. You can exercise, drink water. There's a lot of ways of doing that. Number two, sleep is a priority for me as a survivor of brain injury. If I don't sleep, I can't English. And it sounds like a funny thing, but it's not when you're going through the next day. And I still work as a speech pathologist. So if I've got to go to work the next day and I haven't slept, well, I can tell you right now that my speech therapy isn't going to work out because I won't be able to get the words out in a way that will be beneficial to the individual. And then the other one, I have to make sure that I keep my stress levels low. I have to watch the load I put on my plate. I have to constantly look at how spread I am. How thin are you spread? How much time do you have for self-care? Are you taking the time to do meditation and breath work? Let's create the time to support yourself, your energy, your limits, all those things, right? So for me, being in as good shape as I am, having this conversation with you, it's not without all of that. Right? I'm constantly every day in, day out, how much sleep we getting, the time we have to make sure that we have a bedtime routine, we have a wake up routine, we have routines so that we keep things in order. So everything has a system. You can make things work if you have the right tools, the right systems, the right rhythms, and stick to itness, if you will, also.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I don't remember what was the other question that you had. It was related to how not it wasn't only one thing, right? And how did
Hmm.
I figure those things out? So really it was like one bite at a time. And I really, really mean that. And sometimes I had to like throw that bite up and eat it again. And I know that's graphic, but what I mean by that is like I would take one of those PhD classes. I would go through like, it might make you cry to know, like 60 hours of learning, and then I wouldn't remember enough to be able to pass the test.
Mm.
So I had to start over at the beginning and do that over and over until my brain could learn and remember the information. So those classes at the beginning of my program, some of those I had to do 4 and 5 times.
Mm.
I had to go over that same information.
It doesn't make me cry, but it makes me have, it opens my heart of compassion and empathy for you, but for myself. I mean, I haven't had a traumatic brain injury, but I think, and I have what would probably be categorized as a neurotypical brain. And there are things, there's a program I'm going through and I've been in it for a year and a half. And I still, like, we were talking about something today and I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know there's a 5-point system and I don't know it. And I need to go over it again, right? How many times with my students in the water, we go over the same thing again because a not injured neurotypical brain needs to do that as well. And so it gives me
Yes.
more space and empathy, right, to somebody who has additional factors going on for their brain. So I appreciate you laying it out for us because this is what we need for ourselves and for each other is more empathy and space for folks to be able to thrive in their lives.
And even for the neurotypical brain, if you just look at the basic research on neuroplasticity, so what is that? Neuroplasticity is just a fancy word for your brain can reshape the way that it functions, okay? So your brain, it takes hundreds to thousands of repetitions of the same information before that information is stuck down and nailed in. Hundreds to thousands.
Mm-hmm.
So, like the clients that I work with, I say to them, we're probably going to repeat the same stuff a lot. And it's just what the brain needs. The brain needs a lot of exposure to the same old stuff before it goes, oh, you know what? That's important because I heard that 100 other times, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Really paid attention to that lesson when my children were little. You talk a lot about neuroplasticity with small children. And remember having conversations thinking about there's things that we don't remember in terms of like the way you might remember a storybook. We don't remember things under a certain age. I'm sure probably you can speak more to this as a linguist and because we don't have language, right? That we're not putting it to language as a under 3-year-old. But it kind of begged the question, like, is it important then the things that, events and activities that we're putting our children through, engaging them in different classes and doing different things. But it is because the brain, it has to have something to have exposure to and attached to. And that's how we develop that language out of repeating things over and over again. And why somehow we think when we're an adult, we don't need to do that.
Very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, we have an expectation.
That you're just supposed to get it.
Yep, exactly. Yes. I should pick up that harmonica. That's the one I'm working on. I should pick up that harmonica and be able to play it after one lesson, right? Yeah. Not so much. Not so much. Well, if somebody is I'm wanting to pick up again on this idea that there are many different pieces that you needed to put together and are still putting together to help support your brain and support your growth and your healing. Somebody's sort of doing a new dive into this. Is there an area or a direction or a place where you think people should look to start in terms of taking care of their body-mind connection and take care of their brain?
I think it starts with awareness. Everything begins there. So realizing that it's something you want to work on, you're already moving in the right direction. And in terms of there being many different paths, I think it's different for everyone. I think our paths are as varied as the things within there, right? So if
Mm.
each individual person is multidimensional, I'm suggesting we're all more like a kaleidoscope. So yes, we all are just as multidimensional as the other, but we're also all as unique and individualized as the other. So what one person needs to start today might not be the same thing as the next person that's starting today. So I would just suggest, probably, if they're not sure where to begin, what area of your life would you like to be just a teeny bit better?
Mm.
You got to evaluate that, right? You got to look at it and think, well, what would I want to make better? Because you can, but the first step is you've got to have that awareness, and you've got to kind of make that choice inside of you to where things can line up. So if you have a target, right, if you're going to shoot for a bullseye, you have to know what you're shooting for. So the first thing that I would do is just to identify, what is that for you? You don't have to make big leaps either. So whenever you're starting out, it's actually better and easier and more comfortable if we take those small steps.
Mm-hmm.
So those small steps, they all add up. If you try to make big leaps, you might fall down, right? It might not work out for you. But
Yeah.
if you can take that one little improvement, if you compare yesterday to today, make one tiny little improvement, even if it's like, okay, I'll just use a simple example. Yesterday, if I wanted to drink more water, like I had a client, she had like only half a cup all day, which is not a lot of water, you guys. And for her, getting 8 cups a day, that's just out of the question right now because she's only a half a cup. So I don't want to ask her to drink 8 cups a day, but hey, what if we did a whole cup today? And let's see if we could repeat that again tomorrow. And yeah, we're not at that 8 yet, but we're not going to get to the 8 by going from a half a cup to an 8. It won't happen. There'll be a
Mm-hmm.
disconnect.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it reminds me of another question I was thinking of earlier when you were talking about your journey and having to take the class so many times. And do you recall, or what is it that you were using to help you stay in the process? Because you really do have to have your own back on this. If you're constantly going from a half a cup to 1 cup and beating yourself up about it and just looking at the 7 cups you're not drinking, right? That's not very useful to keeping us moving forward. It's a really useful way for us to contract and to revert to what we've been comfortably uncomfortable in before. So, do you have a sense of what helped you really stay in the game and really stay in investigating, even when it was so challenging?
I mean, I had to adjust my goals for myself. I had to make them bite-sized, and absolutely it would not be helpful to beat myself up over not getting the other 7. We never want to do that. That'll do the opposite of what you're hoping to do.
Mm-hmm.
You won't get buy-in. So the consciousness, your inner child, however you want to think about it, we all have one, no matter if you're 5 or 99, we all have that consciousness in there. And if we set the goal too high, or, and we don't reach it and we beat ourselves up, that's going to create a whole scenario where you don't trust yourself because you made the goal too big and you said you'd do it and then you didn't. You're going to create a whole scenario of negative self-talk, which is going to make you feel bad and release neurochemicals that aren't going to help you. So what I try to say is to focus on what you can do. So you can do that other half cup of water today, and maybe it's 2 ounces at a time, but hey, that's what we want to do. Focus on what we have control over, and it was not pretty. There were weeks where I would set a goal to do a certain number of hours of something or to really nail down a concept, and it just didn't work out. But instead of being like, well, I'm just terrible because I couldn't do that, it's like, well, let's reevaluate that. Let's take it back to the drawing board. And if we set this goal for this week and it didn't work out, let's think about, okay, what factors happened that it didn't work out? All right, we know what those are. We know what our barriers are potentially going to be. Now, for the next week, let's recalibrate. Let's readjust the goal. Because now that I didn't meet the goal last week, there's a part of me inside that has doubt and it doesn't have buy-in anymore. And when you get to that place, it goes, oh, I just can't do it. But so you don't want to get to that place. So I adjust my goal. And yeah, I might be going in the other direction. I might not be expanding. I might need for myself to bring my goal back, to reel it in a little bit and to be consistent with that for a while. And then when I reevaluate in a few weeks and I go, hey, we've been doing better with this and we've really worked around our barriers. Can we go a little bit more? Not all the way out. And maybe not even back to where you were a few weeks ago, but just a tiny little step forward. And that is the way that I worked with myself through all of the things. That's just what's worked for me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I call that going backwards to go forward. And I think it's essential to any learning process to go backwards. I mean, as we were talking before, the brain needs to go over things over and over again. So it's not a mistake. It's not something's not going wrong here, that we pick up things that we didn't know that we were supposed to pick up. We didn't know that they were there. We didn't know what those barriers were till we set that goal as too big. And when we come at it with this gentle evaluation of it and curiosity in it, okay, now I'm ready to see barrier, whatever it is that you couldn't see before until you have this experiment, go get curious. I can open up in a new way. Yeah. Such an important piece of how we take care of ourselves, this mentally and physically. They both go hand in hand there.
And it's important to talk nicely to ourselves. And again, I'm going to say first step is awareness. So if you've never stopped to listen to the thoughts in your mind, I encourage you to. Most of us that are alive on the planet have been kind of programmed through living our life of what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. And we have an internal dialogue all day long. Oh, you shouldn't have done that. Oh, that was stupid. Blah, 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 blah. And if we're not aware of that, we can't tune into that. I have done a lot of work with myself to tune into mine. And so it's equally important, if not more so, that as I'm going through this process of evaluating, right? Because that's when that voice inside really likes to rip one at you if you're not careful. Mm-hmm. But to come from that place of like, what's the most loving thing, right? And and remember that you're dealing with a consciousness, right? Of kind of like a child. So this is how I try to tell people to think about it. Like if your niece or your toddler daughter or your whoever, whatever child you have in your life, would you be screaming at them going, oh, you're so bad, you did it wrong, why can't you get it right? Would you say that to them? And they're like, no, of course not. I would never say that. I would encourage them. Mm-hmm. I would tell them, it's okay. We make mistakes. That happens, right? But we don't do that for our own self most of the time, I would say, right? So equally important to what we were saying in the evaluation process is that you really become aware of that and say, hey, we wanted to do better and we're like, it's okay. We did great. You did great with what we knew right now. We did the best we could with what we knew. And now that we know more, let's set the bar again. And maybe it's to go back and maybe it's to go forward, but let's find a bar, if you will, that you're comfortable with, right? So you got to get that cooperation, and you're not going to get that cooperation if you're yelling at yourself and you're saying that you're bad or you did it wrong. Or it's so important to have that loving consciousness with yourself.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. The loving consciousness with ourselves. And, I always look at it as if it had worked to be mean to yourself, you probably would have all the things by now. Right? If that strategy worked. I mean, I don't know. I think it's the sort of yelling at ourselves kind of way maybe works in an emergency. That might be the usefulness of it, of when you talked about your accident, right? You needed to make a decision. You needed to just command what to do in the moment. And you would never go back and be like, I commanded the wrong way. There couldn't have been a different way, right? You had a decision. You needed that kind of power and command to do something. But most of our life doesn't occur in that sort of situation. And so that yelling, commanding kind of way of being isn't usually helpful for us. Yeah, that having a different, kinder way of being with ourselves for that continued growth. Now, one of the things you had mentioned in, when we asked what you'd like to talk about, you had said why healing starts with safety, not pushing harder. Do you want to elaborate on that? Because this is, again, what we're doing with people in the water, that they have to have physical and emotional safety in order to learn. But I'd love to hear from your point of view and how you work with folks on what you mean by healing starting with safety.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in order for us to even have an opening for growth, we need to have that sense of safety. Because when we're not coming to the table, and that could be in the water, that could be at your job, it could be with your child, it could be in a lot of ways, right? But when we're not feeling safe for whatever reason, we're not going to come to the table with whatever that is from a place of calm, from a place of cooperation. We're going to come from a place of not being safe. And what does that look like? That looks like a lot of frizzy energy, right? It looks like a lot of concern, a lot of fear. But really, when we come to the table, we should be coming and having a seat. Kind of like I said earlier when I start my podcast, I want it to be like we all just take a breath and have a seat together. And so I think for us to really get the most out of all things in life, we kind of need to come to it from that place of safety, from that place of groundedness, because you're not going to learn and you're not going to grow from the other place, right?
Mm-hmm. Frizzy energy. I love that. That's not a descriptor I've heard before, but I really love that. That's a good one. Because, I do think it's helpful for us to understand a contrast. We talk a lot about being calm within. And what's the contrast to that? Oh, yeah, frizzy energy. I can feel that and grab onto that. That it's not energy, it's false productive energy, that you might be able to sporadically do things. But it's, it makes my mind go to a fizzy drink. It's
Yes.
like pops all that energy off, but is different than quenching your thirst, than actually consuming and having that water come into your body and healing into your body as it comes all the way in. So that was a lovely visual, fizzy energy. Nice. Well, anything else that you would like people to know about practices for change and for healing and caring for themselves?
There's so many. There are probably at least thousands that I myself have used. So it really just depends on the level that we're talking, right? Are we talking about a physical, emotional, mental, spiritual? There's a lot of tools, and I'm going to do a webinar series May 5th, 12th, and 19th called From Overwhelm to Coherence. And it's all about everything we're talking about and more, including gut brain health and nervous system and hormones and how to keep the calm. So you guys are all invited to that. And be loving with yourself. Be loving with the person next to you. I would say whenever you have that knee-jerk reaction moment in your day where you want to judge somebody for one reason or another, right? Whether they cut you off in traffic or maybe they were really rude to you and it was inappropriate. Instead of judging that, here's my tip for you. I want you to consider that kaleidoscope, and I want you to consider that there's probably other angles. Maybe they have a brain injury and they don't have the social skills to have handled that interaction, or, maybe they cut you off in traffic because their daughter is in the ER and they're trying to get there fast. I always, in these situations, really try hard to consider whatever alternate scenario to whatever my brain is telling me right in that moment. Because the reality is, it's always more going on than what you're able to see. We're only seeing the very, very tip of the iceberg, but for that individual, everything else under the surface, you're not going to be able to see. So I just encourage everyone to Remember that about yourself too, right? Everyone you meet has no idea what's underneath the surface. They can only see the tip of your iceberg. And it
Hmm.
is okay to say that there's more to you than maybe they know. So,
Absolutely. I love that you brought it back to yourself, starting with this having compassion, loving compassion, and curiosity for others. And when we have those judgment moments, which we all have, it's useful as an adult to have judgment. We're supposed to have judgment. It's when it tips over into judgmental. That's when it starts to become problematic. But practicing that loving curiosity and then how you brought it back to yourself, because that's where it really starts. I think the more I have learned to have compassion and more to my own internal story, like you laid out, those goals that are too big, and instead of harassing myself about them, I bring that loving curiosity into what else is there. The better I've gotten with that, the better I do it externally, the better I get, of doing it internally. It's this nice synergistic building on itself. So thank you so much for being with us today, and tell folks how they could get connected to you. We'll, of course, put that in the show notes, and we'll put your webinar in the show notes for folks to be able to come into that. But how can people find out more about you and connect with you?
my website is neurosynergyhealth.com. So we'll just put the link in the show notes, and having me spell that out is
Yeah,
can be a little interesting. But I'll send you everything over for the webinar. I'm also on LinkedIn and Instagram, Facebook, all the places. So you're welcome to connect with me there, or you can email me at drSarahYoung@neurosynergyhealth.com.
great. Thank you so much for being here, and have an amazing, beautiful day. And I think, gosh, I'm going to say it was you who reminded me at the end of the podcast, whatever comes up and whatever we talk about is exactly right and exactly what we needed to have today. So definitely felt that today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.